The interviewer is Daniel Martinez from the National Park Service, USS Arizona Memorial. The subject today is Rear Admiral Edwin M. Wilson, and Mr. Wilson at this time is age 74. Admiral, good morning.
Good morning.
Admiral, for the record, would you please state your full name for us?
Edwin Mark Wilson, Jr.
And you were born when, Admiral?
I was born June 8th, 1918 in St. Paul, Minnesota.
What often isn't covered in some of these interviews is the relationship you have with the other man that flies with you.
Okay.
Tell me mechanically how that all works, what your responsibilities were, what his responsibilities were.
What happened is when we finally commissioned an air group there on October 10th, 1942. The Air Group 11 was commissioned, and we had a big ceremony there, and that was a VB-11, which was a dive bombing squadron, VF-11, which is a fighter squadron, VS-11, which was another SBD squadron, and we did almost the same things, but they call it a scouting squadron, and then the fourth was a VT-11, which was a torpedo squadron. So what happened is they had been training radioman gunners, and the radioman gunners, their job was to handle some of the radio deals and also to fire the guns in the rear and generally just to do whatever the pilot ordered them to do.
Did they do any observation for you?
Oh, sure. In other words, it was like another set of eyes in the back, and they had been training as in their particular functions, just like we were training in our pilot functions, and I can remember they finally assigned radioman gunners to the pilots, and then they would be a team the whole tour. So what happened is I could remember walking across the apron there at North Island, and I saw one of the gunners there. I knew what his name was, but apparently he didn't know my name. I said, well, I see that all the gunners have been assigned to the pilots. And he said, yes. And he says, I'm a little unhappy. And I said, why is that? And he says, I've been assigned to an Ensign Wilson, and I was hoping to be assigned to Ensign Ford. And so I said, maybe you'll get to like Ensign Wilson, all right. He says, well, I don't know. I sure wish I was with Ensign Ford. Next day we go to the planes, and he was a little aghast when he saw I was Ensign Wilson after that chat of the day before. But we flew together for over 3 years, both tours. My first tour at Guadalcanal, and my second tour off the Hornet. We've maintained contact. He now lives in Guam, and Barrett Tillman, who's here, when he wrote Dauntless, I had him write a nice inscription to Harry Jespersen, my gunner, in the book, and then I wrote something and sent it to him, and he sent a nice letter back. While we were at North Island, when I checked in there, I went into the BOQ, and they said, well, Ensign, your BOQ's all filled up. You're going to have to go into town. I said, oh, no, you don't. I said, I'll sit here until somebody checks out. I says, I've really worked hard as cadets and all that, look forward to the days when they could live with the officers in the BOQ. So this was going to be my first BOQ.
Right.
And so I wanted to live in it. But anyway, so I sat there for a while, and this Filipino chief who was running the desk at the club, I guess he got tired of looking at me. And he kept telling me nobody was going to check out. And I said, there's always somebody checking out of the BOQ. He said, well, there's nobody's going to check out. So I guess he got tired of looking at me, and he called somebody. And finally he says, Ensign, he said, Lieutenant Commander so-and-so, I forget what the name was, wants to talk to you. And I went over there. And this lieutenant commander barked at me, and he says, listen, Ensign, if the chief says you got to go into town, you got to go into town. Now get your butt into town. I said, I'm saluting over the phone. So in town was the Hotel del Coronado, and we really enjoyed our stay there in the Hotel del Coronado.
Those aren't bad quarters.
Very stately old hotel, sort of like the Menger that's here in San Antonio. Anyway, what happened was that we were quartered there, and amazingly enough, at that time, the Hotel del Coronado was, I would say, 75% occupied by wealthy widows who had put 2, 3, and 4 rooms together and packed all their antique furniture in. And every time, and I think they kept about 10% of that Hotel del Coronado for in and out traffic, and the rest. And so the rest was the widows and some Navy pilots. And we always knew when the Hotel del Coronado needed, or the Navy needed more rooms than the Hotel del, because there'd always be a headline in the San Diego Union, Japs subsided off Point Loma. And we knew that was a signal, because then the 2 or 3 of the wealthy widows would move to the Midwest, and the Navy would get that bank of rooms. But and we call it the Wheels Down Hotel. There was nothing in that Strand there, which is now filled up with apartments and everything else. And we'd fly straight down the Strand, and at the Hotel del, we'd lower our wheels and then land at the mat. There was a big mat, and the only thing wrong with the mat is many times we'd take 18 plane formation takeoffs there, and that was kind of hairy. But we called it the Wheels Down Hotel because that's where we lowered the wheels. And the Hotel del Coronado used to run them up the wall because they were so distinguished. I love that old hotel.
Sure.
And they didn't like it to be called the Wheels Down Hotel, but that was our name for it. It was a nice days there.
We talked about what the gunner's responsibilities were. If we can go back, I'd like to know what your responsibilities in that cockpit were. Obviously, you're an officer, but you have.
I was in complete control. He was just back there to assist me in any way he could. He was to be my eyes aft, and he was to man the guns if needed.
You handled navigation?
I handled all the navigation. We had a little plotting board that came out, and it was dead reckoning. The Navy carrier pilots always operated by dead reckoning. They knew where they were by where they had been and where they started out from. And then even when you're operating off carriers and so on and so forth, they would always tell you what their course would be. So even though we were out of sight and we were a long ways from the carrier coming back, we knew where they were going to be, and we would factor that in. But every pilot had to do his own navigating on the board. So the gunner had nothing to do with that. He would monitor the radio and basically be the eyes back there. Now later in the rear seats we got radar. Mm-hmm. Now then he picked up a new duty of manning the radar.
You're up there in the cockpit. You also have your bombing responsibilities.
Right.
The type of bomb you carried underneath there, you carried over a 500-pound bomb, correct?
It all depended how far you were going. In other words, that would determine how big a bomb you could carry. If you had to go a long distance, then it was all fuel, and you could carry less bombs. But we'd carry sometimes about a 1,200-pound armor-piercing bomb if you're going after ships, or a 1,000-pound bomb, or a 500-pound bomb.
So you had a variety of ordnance you could carry.
Yeah. And we had 250, like the gunner had twin 30s in the back.
Right.
And he had a little belt that goes around and hooked down there so he could almost stand up a little and operate the deal. And then there was stops so he wouldn't shoot the tail off.
Right.
And then our responsibility, of course, was the bomb deal. He had nothing to do with the bombing.
You had a sighting tube that you used?
At that time in the SBD, we had a telescopic sight. It was just a long sight that went through. He had the twin 30s, we had twin 50s, and our twin 50s fired through the prop, just like the old SPADs in World War I. You got a nice feeling of participation because You were right with the noise and the smoke. But they were two good guns.
You leave North Island. Where are you assigned?
We were formed to go aboard the old Hornet. That's the old Hornet, and that's the one that General Doolittle flew off of. And General Doolittle's a friend of mine, and now lives in Carmel. But we were scheduled to go aboard the old Hornet, and it got sunk. And this is how we ended up at Guadalcanal, because here we were a carrier replacement air group, but the carrier that we were scheduled to go aboard got sunk. And so that's how we ended up at Guadalcanal and being land-based in our first tour.
How'd they get you there?
Well, what happened is we went out to Ford Island, and we flew out of Ford Island for a while. And that's, of course, when they had the blackout. They still had the blackout. We had to carry gas masks. They had blackouts even on the cars and the Jeeps and everything else. The gas mask was a nice little square grayish blue deal, and everybody had to carry one. We threw out the gas mask at Naval Aviators and put a bottle of Haig Pinch in there, scotch. But that's when you could buy in 42, you could still buy good scotch. That was before the liquor industry went blotto, and all we could get was Shenley's Black Death or some old rums or something. But anyway.
So it made a nice haversack for liquor.
That's right. And everybody liked Hawaii. The only thing we didn't like about Ford Island is the boat going from Pearl over to Ford Island. They always cut it off at midnight. And so as a result, we had to be there before midnight. Otherwise, a couple of times you could phone over there if you had lots of rank. I posed as a rear admiral back in as a ensign in those days, because you could get the duty officer over at Fort Island. And I'd say, "Get that boat over here and pick us up immediately." And he said, "Who is this?" I said, "This is Edwin," like this. And he said, "Yes, sir, yes, sir." And then when the boat would come over.
So they leave the boathouse over there.
When the boat would come over, they'd say, "Where's the admiral?" I says, "Boy, you guys are in trouble." I says, "He is mad as hell," and he left. I said, "But how about a ride back?" So I worked that about 3 times, but they never caught on to that. But anyway, the blackout was a pain in the neck, and also barbed wire and all the beach at Waikiki. And in the daytime, so you could go swimming, they had little gates that would open in the barbed wire, and the minute it was dusk, they'd close it off. They were really paranoid about invasion.
You could still see at Ford Island the wreckage of the battleships along Battleship Row were still present.
Oh, yeah.
When did they
Ford Island is right next to it.
Yeah, sure. When did they dispatch you out of Guadalcanal, and how did they move your air group?
What happened is we were the first air group out to Barbers Point, and that was nice, except that you had a dirt road out there. Now today we got a nice about 4-lane highway, but and we lose Jeeps out there in the sugarcane. I think I lost 2 Jeeps because you'd straighten out curves or you'd overrun your little deadlight.
At night, right? Because you couldn't see.
That's right. But we liked Barbers Point. We went from there, and then we did carrier qualifications there, did a lot of dive bombing training and so on and so forth. And then we went out to we went aboard ship, went out to Nandi in the Fijis, and they had a Marston mat strip there, which is now a big, beautiful, enormous airport. I've been there.
Do you know what carrier you went out on? Or?
I think it was the Altamaha. It was Jeep carrier.
A Jeep carrier.
And and so about a month and a half we flew out of Nandi. We had a P-40 New Zealand P-40 fighter squadron with us. We had a terrible casualty there. I was out flying. We were doing dive bombing exercises, and our fighters would be protecting us, and the P-40s with the New Zealanders would make an attack on us. And right in the section that I was following, all of a sudden, out of the sky comes this P-40, and bang, goes right into Herb Schonk's plane. I guess and it was the P-40 squadron skipper, New Zealand skipper, and he came right down on Herb Schonk. Herb Schonk had been in the Battle of Coral Sea and so on and so forth aboard the Lexington, and VB-2, because our squadron was formed by the nucleus of the 5 guys coming back from VB-2 in the Lexington. And anyway, amazing at mid-air collisions is in a mid-air collision, it seems that there's such a fantastic explosion that hardly anything is left. Sitting in the pool at that Hotel del Coronado, I watched 2 P-38s crash together, and sometimes it looks like there's no more than anything that the biggest piece is about the size of your fist. Well, it was the same way when this P-40 and the Herb Schonk. So that was our carrier. They both killed, of course, immediately. And but that P-40 squadron then went into Guadalcanal with us, and they were flying out of Guadalcanal, New Zealand. Good pilots.
Were you the first air group to go into Guadalcanal, or was there?
Oh no, there was scattering. I think we were the first, what you'd call, carrier air group to go in there. And we got in there in April, just shortly after that Yamamoto was shot down, and
April of 42.
Yeah, and no, this was April 43. Of 43, and it was just after Yamamoto was shot down, which we didn't know anything about. And it was just after, of course, the February. The Guadalcanal itself was, they said, officially secured. It didn't seem secured to us because the Bettys came over damn near every night bombing and so on and so forth, and there was a lot of action around there, and the Japanese would come in and bomb the ships there and so on and so forth. So,
do you remember your first experience, not necessarily in the air, but just being in a combat zone? What impression did that leave on you?
Well, our first impression, of course, of Guadalcanal was everything they said it was. It was muddy and filthy and dirty, and they issued us tents, and we had to put them up, and we were all in a row of all the trees, like Miami, Florida, because of hurricanes and everything. The trees are all sort of haphazard and grow in different directions. But there in Guadalcanal, the old copra plantation, the coconut trees were straight up and all in line, and we're in one of the rows in between the palm trees, and they called it Suckers Row because sergeants, Marines, and Army and all that were always trying to sell us Army. All they wanted was booze. They could then convert the booze to about $50 to $75 a bottle. So they didn't want money from us. They wanted booze, and for $5 you could get a samurai sword, and for $2 you could get a sort of a non-commissioned sword. They had their prices for everything. But our first combat was mostly land targets there. We hit places, and what we did is even though Guadalcanal itself was secured, and they were still have remnants of Japanese, and it was still being bombed every night, but it started to move back up the ladder back towards New Guinea, and so we were hitting a lot of land targets, supporting invasions of Munda, Vela.
What kind of land targets would we be talking?
We would go after planes if they were there. We would go after anti-aircraft, and we would go after artillery emplacements and anything that would reduce the efficiency, say, of an airfield or of a defensive force for the particular invasion. My combat was always you always tried to get a hit, and on May 8th was my big day. We went up against the torpedo planes, and some destroyers had laid some mines in Blackett Strait, which became famous later because that's where Jack Kennedy got his PT-109 rammed. But on that particular strike, it was very bad weather, and we came in, got lower and lower because there's layers in the deal, and finally, when it came to attack, when I started to go down, all of a sudden the hole closed up, so I veered off to the side and I just circled. Well, the other planes went on and made their attack and headed on back, so I just circled and circled, and all of a sudden a hole opened up, and here was a destroyer, and I was probably at about 4,000 feet, and I got a little excited, I guess, and I opened my dive brakes, which normally you would do when you're coming straight down from 10,000. So I came in on the...
That'll cut your airspeed a little, won't it?
Oh, yeah. I was going slow as hell. I thought I'd never get to the destroyer. And I dropped, I guess, about 600 feet and got some of the blast. And it was a no-deflection shot for them. I'm the only plane in the air, and I'm coming in from the sides. And I never saw so much stuff coming at me, firing at me. Holes were appearing in my wings, and I could see all the tracers and everything going by.
What did you think about? I mean, I've never been in that kind of combat situation. For those of us who haven't been there, is it a bit unreal, or is it?
Well, no. You're just all you're intent on is how to hit that thing, and I hit it. And when I dropped the bomb, I could really feel the concussion, and the plane went up a little, and then I veered off and looked back, and my gunner reported before he could see things before I could see things, and turning around.
Now, was he peppering away after you passed? Does the rear gunner try to pepper?
Well, what happened was he was not in a position to fire until as we pulled out. He said that I'd hit it at midship, and it looked like the whole destroyer blew up. And so then there was landing barges coming ashore and so on and so forth from other ships, and I strafed those right down in the water in the 20s, and they were firing small arm fires at me from the deals.
Could you see individuals at the altitude you were flying at?
Sure. I could see these guys firing at me with their rifles and their pistols, because I was right down in the water, about 20 feet off the water, probably right into them.
And on your bombing mission, you say you pulled out at 600 feet?
Well, in this one, I started. I dropped my bomb at about 600 feet. I was right above it. Normally, you don't drop that when you're coming down because you have to have room to pull out. But in this one, it was because of the weather factor and so on and so forth. So anyway, I emptied my guns, and then I circled around these landing barges and let him finish up his 30s, and then I realized we were out of ammo. He was out of ammo, and I better get my Fanny back to Henderson Field. And that's when you begin to feel a little lonely. There's no other planes around. I was by myself. So I headed on back, and when I told them this Harry story, I think they were a little skeptical. But the next morning, the Coast Watcher, Reg Evans, I later found out his name, who was on Columbangara, and he was the one that later saved Jack Kennedy. Called in and said all these planes came down and there's no damage or anything else, and he says they disappeared, and all of a sudden one single little plane came out of the air and blew up this destroyer. So when he reported that, I got full credit for the hit. And
the vessel sink?
Yeah. And so
did you ever catch the name of that destroyer, or ever find out which destroyer it was?
No.
That's interesting. So that was your.
But I did look at. I did try and find later, when I was in Sydney, I tried to find Reg Evans to thank him for confirming that hit, and he'd already died.
I see.
Martin Clemens, who was here as one of the Coast Watchers, of course, knew Reg Evans very well. But then the next time was quite a bit later. So that was the first time I saw a Jap ship. And
a question that sometimes comes in people's minds that haven't been in combat. Initially, I guess you're so focused on what you're doing. At any time when you were flying back, or did that fear set in, what you had gone through? Or I
can't ever remember, to be frank with you, ever being afraid. But I felt lonely as hell going back, because I'm the only plane, and I'm wondering if anybody's going to be chasing.
How far was back? How many miles did you have to fly?
I don't know. Columbangara and Blackett Strait, I don't know. I imagine probably about 200, 300 miles somewhere.
Now, did you stay low because of the fighters might be in the area, or
No, I was already low, so I just stayed there and headed on back. And the minute I landed, my engine quit. I ran out of fuel. The minute I landed, and they had to tow me off the field.
So your first real major combat?
Yeah, that was my first deal, but that was a very satisfying one. Then later, then the only time we went after, the fighters had what they call auxiliary tanks that they could drop, say when they get in combat, but it gave them longer legs and they could go farther out. So we had a leading chief named Bass, and he figured out how he could put those and rig it on the SBDs, and that gave us enough range to go to Bougainville, Kahili, and so we finally went there towards the end of our tour, Henderson Field, and and they had quite a few destroyers in the harbor there. And we could see the Zeros taking off and the dust off the field and so on and so forth. And the fighters were swarming around. That was the only time that we really had Japanese fighters around us. Usually the fighters did a pretty good job of keeping them away from us.
But when you went on these missions, you did go with fighter cover. That was still...
Oh, yeah. Fighters always went with us. They'd usually have fighter sweeps before, and then there'd be high cover, low cover, and medium cover to the side. No, they did a beautiful job for us. They took more casualties than we dive bombers.
Yeah.
They protected us pretty well, but many times they didn't protect themselves as well.
The Hollywood impression of aerial combat in the Pacific or even over Europe is that there's a lot of chatter going on. Were you able to speak with the fighter pilots, or was that strictly restricted to your group?
There was always a lot of chatter when you got into combat because the fighters were screaming at one another, somebody's on your tail, or I'll get him, or watch out to the right, or something like that. But we tried to keep en route to a target. En route to a target, we would always maintain radio silence so they wouldn't know we're coming. But the minute they knew where we are, then you could do anything in the radio. But there's always a lot of chatter. At this particular day, when I made a dive, there was two destroyers that were sort of moored together, and I figured if I could just get in the middle of them, I'd get two for the price of one. And as I pulled out, my gunner said I hit the one on the right side, so I didn't get exactly in the middle like I wanted to. But anyways, I pulled out. I'm looking back to see where my bomb went off, and all of a sudden this Zero went right in front of me. If I had been looking ahead, I could have probably shot him down with my twin 50s, but my gunner in the rear, as he went up, he got him. He exploded right off my right side. So that was probably the first time that we had Zeros that proximate to us, and that were making runs on us. But most of the times we were supporting invasions, close air support. We were doing submarine patrols. We had, and at the Russell Islands, they were building a little strip across it was a small island, but they wanted to get a little closer to Rabaul and to Bougainville, and right straight across this island they had it was a coral island, so they were scraping it and making a coral runway. And VB-11's job was in the morning. The Seabees liked an up-to-date deal, where there were Marines there and Seabees there, and they wanted an up-to-date deal. So somebody would be assigned to take the picture in the morning. They'd develop the pictures, and they'd come back in the little packet. They would drop it out the side in this little tent complex at the Seabees, and it became a little sort of macho thing to get as low and as close to them as possible when you threw the packet out. And so I never forget Bill Mackey, one of our ensigns, had the duty to drop the packet, and before he landed, they called and they said he was the lowest they've ever seen anybody come down that coral runway, and they said he was so low that dust was coming up off the runway. Well, when Mackey got back and he cut the engine in the SBD, he had chopped 4 inches off the prop, each blade. he just gone down that nice coral runway, grinding his
And he still remained airworthy.
Yeah, it didn't seem to bother at all. And that was the first, what they'd call that squared off wingtips, which later they had on other planes years later.
Right.
So I guess he was the first one with it chopped off.
One of the things that also is not recorded is, could you be rather profane over the radio? Or was there restrictions on that? Modern movies have...
There was no restrictions in anything. In other words, anybody could say anything they wanted. And if primary target was obliterated, we had the power, if you were leading the hop, to hit anything you want. In other words, if you took all the time to get out there with your bombs, they wanted you to hit something worthwhile. We had that in this first tour. We had that in the second tour. In the second tour, I was a strike leader. In the first tour, I ended up being a division leader, which is 2 3-plane sections that the dive bombers fly. But the Guadalcanal is we called it our carrier appreciation tour because, in a carrier, you're always clean. You got nice sheets, you always get good chow, and so on and so forth. Your planes are always clean. And there at Guadalcanal, you'd go to your plane, you'd walk through mud to get to your plane. You get in the plane, the mud would dry. And when you're making a dive from about 10,000 feet and you're coming down, you're at zero gravity. In other words, we experience what, say, the astronauts do, of weightlessness and so on and so forth. Back in those days, I was a smoker, and the cigarettes had come out, and they'd hang right in front of you, and you'd have to move them aside so you could see your sight. But the mud, we'd have to really put our collar tight and everything else, because all this mud, as it dried, it would go up, and then it'd come down your back and everything else. You'd have mud all over you. And so as a result, we didn't like that type of flying. It was just nice to have a clean cockpit. You never had problems like that, say, when you're flying off a carrier. So we call that the Carrier Appreciation Tour. It made us like carriers. We lived in the tents in the mud. About the only we had a lot of mice and rats there, and we were always. I figured out a sort of like the old pirate days of walking the plank, but I had a big pail of water and a little sort of 2-inch deal, and it was a teeter-totter, so that once you got over the water, we'd put Spam or something like that in the end, and the mouse or the rat would go out. He'd just teeter-totter into the water. First time I had it too close to my bunk, and then he splashed all over me in the bunk, and then they'd squeal for a while they were dying, so we'd put them farther away from our bunk, which we had mosquito netting over our cots.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. How were the insects over there?
Well, what happens with the mosquito netting, I always thought that was sort of a phony thing, because everybody in their sleep, puts an arm against there, and you'd wake up in the morning, they'd been feeding on you where your arm was against the mosquito netting. We took Atibrin there. They'd run out of quinine, and we took Atibrin to protect us against malaria, but made us turn yellow, and our eyeballs turned yellow. We looked like the fellows we were fighting. But the chow and then they would build foxholes. They'd dig out a trench, and then they'd put palm logs across and palm fronds in the deal
for bomb shelters.
For bomb shelters at night, and it was not only against the enemy bombs that you were worried about, because we had 90 millimeters and 5-inch anti-aircraft, and that stuff goes up, comes down. And many times we'd stay in our sack or something and say, the hell with it, I'm not going to that foxhole tonight. And the next morning there'd be all nice little holes in your tent, and you decide.
Some shrapnel, huh?
Shrapnel. So we hit the foxholes, but they had a standing warning there that as you're in the foxholes, if something crawls on you, don't hit it, or don't slap it, or don't try and push it away, because they had scorpions, they had tarantulas, they had every damn thing that could bite there, and they said, if you hit it, it's going to bite you. So we just sit there and feel these things crawling over you, and that wasn't nice. And I used to sit there in that foxhole at night and think about the fact that I was in that beautiful Hotel del Coronado, and now I'm sitting in this muddy, filthy place getting bombed. I said, this is the wrong way, because you always Horatio Alger, rags to riches. I said, geez, I'm going the wrong way. I'm going from riches to rags. So I never thought it was a little fair in that. Yeah.
What was the mortality rate at that time of your group?
We actually only lost one pilot. And that raid against Bougainville, Pidge Hughes, who was a lacrosse player from Dartmouth, and he and his gunner, we don't know what happened to him. He just disappeared in that hop. We had other fellows that would go down, but the fighters took the losses there. Fighters in the torpedo planes took the losses. The one of the fellows that had to ditch his plane and so on and so forth, a fellow named Stussy, when he went to activate his Mae West because of the CO2 bottles, and it was a little mad at us because we had taken all the CO2 bottles out of all the Mae West to make soda water in our Fizz Kings. He was a little mad at us.
So you had to blow him up.
Yeah, they had to blow him up with a little hose.
I mean, we could go on for a long time, and it really warrants that because you've had such a distinguished career in the Navy. But primarily, we focused on this Guadalcanal battle and your role in it. Did you ever have any doubts within yourself what you would be like in combat?
No.
You're fully confident.
No.
That's interesting. Thank you.